Hello and welcome to our December third-party roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, John Cassell, here to give us an inside look on the newest third-party patch releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and John will reach out after to answer those. And with that, John Cassell.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for attending today's third-party roundup webcast. Today, I will be covering some of the most popular third-party applications that have received updates since the start of December. We'll be covering a few that ended up actually getting released in November, and we'll cover that off as well. But with the holidays coming up soon, we've decided to have this webcast a little early this month. Don't worry, there's still been plenty of security bulletins. I make a joke, of course, it's not a good thing, and advisories throughout the month. But of course, we're going to cover all of them and as well talk about resolutions, of course, across multiple version updates and various products. As a background, I always want to cover this with this webcast to shine a little light on, of course, why we're covering these particular areas. For most third-party applications, we really don't have any idea when they're going to be provided by their vendors. Most manufacturers have no guaranteed release cadence that we can rely on, at least. However, a lot have actually been using, for example, the second Tuesday of the month for well over a decade. Some other manufacturers have followed suit in recent years, like Adobe. We'll be covering that today. And again, I typically cover this on the last Tuesday of the month so that I can capture most of the month's releases. But next month will probably be a pretty consolidated call. A lot of information to cover next month. As well, there are some other manufacturers like Oracle. Won't be talking so much about theirs today because they didn't have an advisory, but some actually do have a release cadence that's quarterly that we can rely on as well. So those are also very reliable. So if we're ever talking about Java or any other Oracle product, we can also look to those vendors and expect that we'll receive it either October, January, or in the spring, and so on and so forth. But first, let's briefly discuss what a vulnerability is versus a patch, or what a patch or an update does. This, of course, will help us understand a little bit more if you're not familiar with this content as we start jumping into the manufacturer updates of these widely used products, what it is that we'll be using in terms of, in terminology. A vulnerability is a bug or a misconfiguration in a product, an application, or an operating system that, if exploited, allows that product or system to be compromised by an attacker. A patch or an update, which is going to be our main focus today, patchable products, are devised to resolve the vulnerability. With that said, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve the vulnerabilities. Many patches are out there as simply optional. We don't focus on those as much in this webcast because we, of course, want to focus on what is actually more of a concern. So we are looking at patches that, again, typically resolve vulnerabilities. If there is, however, a vulnerability that exists in a product or a system and no patch or workaround is available, then the vulnerability is considered a zero-day exploit. We do have, unfortunately, a few of those to cover today as well. Before we get into the latest updates, though, how do we prioritize them? There are many strategies out there. Here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. The first is going to be vendor severity. This typically ranges from critical severity to non-applicable, and comes directly from the manufacturer of that update. We'll actually be looking at a few of those today. Manufacturers can kind of weight that and use whatever scale that they really they prefer. We do have some of those differences, especially when we look at vendors like Adobe. They flip it upside down, which we'll be talking about. Their priority is a bit of a difference there. And as well, they do use different terms, so we reclassify a lot of those. It is always important to check the vendor severity, but do bear in mind that it can clearly be a biased rating. It's a rating from the manufacturer that created, of course, that product. Many of them, of course, don't receive severities because it would highlight, obviously, that product, application, even a service in some type of negative light. We appreciate that as well when manufacturers do release that information because it builds trust. To combat this, we instead prioritize the industry severity a little more, as many would agree, such as the CVSS or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, calculated by an independent organization. This score ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe and critical. The higher the rating, it typically entails higher possibility of exploitation. And as well, there are many other factors that do still or pipe into the CVSS score, which we'll be covering in a little bit as well. So it does correlate. We deal with the state of the vulnerability as well, such as weaponization. This means that it's actively being exploited in the wild and can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. So if anything has been weaponized, it means that it has been exploited again, and there's reason to believe it could occur again. When vulnerabilities become publicly disclosed, it means that the structure or the blueprint of the bug has been exposed to the industry. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's currently being exploited. Usually they can go hand in hand, but that the details are out there. These are typically published by bug bounty programs, indicators, or sometimes the manufacturer. Countermeasures are also a possibility and are provided in two ways, either a mitigation, such as a configuration from an antivirus or an EDR that is stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently deploying system reconfiguration. And the other countermeasure is a workaround, such as a registry, a policy, or a service configuration change that also prevents the vulnerability from being exploited. And a great example of this is, at least in my experience, when Microsoft provides a recommended policy or registry change, either instead of a patch or after a patch. We have post-patching scenarios as well, in which case you may deploy the patch, but there's still an advisory to do something different just to make a slight tweak. Mitigations themselves are going to be that extra tweak. Determining our strategy is exposure. And this breakdown is based simply on which tool or solutions being used to detect and report on outstanding vulnerabilities across the device fleet. So using all this information, and then of course, where it fits into our environment will give us that exposure. Every environment, again, is different, typically includes various versions of operating systems. So knowing, of course, where those vulnerabilities exist allow us to better target our endpoints for remediation and fixing it overall. Jumping into it, the third-party products that we'll be discussing today have all received updates since, again, the month started. A few days earlier than that, we'll cover that off as well, since there were a few days in November since our last webcast. And again, all resolve some sort of vulnerability. That's the main focus of the updates that we cover. Most products have also been mentioned with some sort of advisory, many receiving alerts from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to update as soon as possible. I typically call that CISA, but in case you're not sure what that is, that's what it stands for. So first one I always cover off is Adobe, and a lot of this is in alphabetical order, and then as well as critical severity of what I typically see month after month. And after many years of looking at assessing these updates, I've put Adobe first. Fortunately for this month, compared to last month was a pretty big release. This one's slightly less, with 9 products that were patched. Many of these may or may not apply to you. I'm going to go through a number of them fairly quickly, only because the severity of the updates actually, or their fixes rather, were not actually that high. So the first is going to be Adobe Prelude. There was one moderate memory leak fix, affecting Windows devices, although an update is available for both Windows and Mac OS. Adobe Illustrator received 3 critical fixes affecting Windows and Mac OS. All 3 critical issues were rated 7.8 on the CVSS scale and related to out-of-bounds read, out-of-bounds write, and use after free issues that, if exploited, could all lead to arbitrary code execution. Adobe InDesign received 2 important fixes, both with CVSS scores, say moderate, of 5.5, affecting, again, Windows and Mac OS devices. Fixes include null pointer dereference that could lead to app denial of service, and out-of-bounds read issue that could lead to memory leak. Adobe Dimension received 4 fixes, all for out-of-bounds read issues leading to, again, memory leak. This affects Windows and Mac OS devices. 3 of the issues are moderate with CVSS of 3.3. Might actually classify that maybe as low. With one important, that's Adobe's. That's Adobe's recommendation of saying that CVSS 3.3 is moderate. So that's a little subjective, I would say. I would probably put a CVSS of less than 4 in the low category. But there was one important fix there with a CVSS of 5.5. Adobe Experience Manager, huge release for 194 That's right, 194 important and moderate issues. But this is a little bit different. So I just want to throw this in because it was part of I'd say the biggest chunk of the release. 193 of the 194 issues were all related to cross-site scripting issues that, if exploited, they could all lead to arbitrary code execution. The one other fix was for an improper access control issue that could lead to security feature bypass if exploited. Now, this only affects cloud services and they are patched automatically. So a lot of fixes there, but if you're using Experience Manager, it is cloud-based, so it's not a product that you would have to chase. Certainly if we're talking about a distributed application, you wouldn't have to chase your end users in any way. Adobe Substance 3D Stager received two important out-of-bound read fixes affecting Windows and Mac OS. Both issues have a CVSS score. I'm sorry, that's affecting all platforms. There are actually other operating systems that it does affect. Both issues have a CVSS score of 5.5 and could lead to memory leak. Substance 3D Sampler, which also affects all of its platforms, received a fix for 6 critical out-of-bounds write issues. All vulnerabilities are rated with a CVSS score of 7.8, higher on the scale, and if exploited, could again lead to arbitrary code execution. Adobe After Effects, there were 4 issues, 3 critical, 1 moderate, affecting Windows and Mac OS. These issues include out-of-bounds write, improper input validation, and use after free issues rated with CVSS scores of 7.8, again high, but not critical, I would say from a CVSS standpoint. And if exploited, could also lead to arbitrary code execution. The out-of-bounds read issue, rated with a lower CVSS of 3.3, could also lead to memory leak. Substance 3D Designer fixed 4 issues, with 1 rated critical and 3 important. This also affects all platforms. The critical out-of-bounds write has a CVSS score of 7.8, and if exploited, could lead to, yes, arbitrary code execution. And the other 3 out-of-bounds read issues with CVSS scores of 5.5 could all lead to memory leak, of course, if exploited. Now, with all the previously listed Adobe updates that I just went through, they were all assigned a lower priority of 3 from Adobe. When it comes to Adobe advisories, the higher the number, the better. Actually, let me rephrase that. The higher the better, as the lower score, the more severe, and typically correlates with publicly disclosed or actively exploited issues. Like the next update that I'm going to mention, all of the products I just mentioned were their typical advisory on the second Tuesday on the 12th of December. An out-of-band was released on December 15th for Experience Manager Forms, where a dependency update was based on actually Apache struts, affecting Experience Manager Forms on JEE versions 6. I'm reading this off their website, 6.5.19.0 and earlier for all platforms. This particular update was released to resolve a critical vulnerability with a 9.8 CVSS score. Remember, the CVSS is out of 10. This is tracked to CVE 2023-50164. To quote the website, or actually to quote NVD here, so this is the independent party. An attacker can manipulate file upload params to enable paths traversal, and under some circumstances, this can lead to uploading a malicious file, leading to remote code execution. This received a priority 1 from Adobe. 1 is not good when it comes to Adobe's priority system. That means that it is the highest, and it is the most likely for exploitation. So moving on to the next manufacturer, talk about Chrome. This has been an interesting one, and it is usually month after month. There have been 3 releases since our last webcast, and actually, I'm sorry, 4 releases. And just going to do a double check. I did this last time. There we go. Okay, we have something interesting to talk about. I'll save this to the end. There have been 5 releases. Once again, and for the 4th month in a row now, Google dropped an update for Chrome on the same day of our webcast, actually the 5th month, because it just dropped just a few minutes ago. So we'll cover that, keeping things spicy. Of course, this occurred later in the day after last month's webcast. This happens to be the case, of course, with the November 28th release. On November 28th, Chrome, or I should say Google for Chrome, released resolved 7 security fixes 6 were disclosed by external researchers for a total in $55,000 USD in bounties. That's fairly large, given your kind of average bounty payout. This included type confusion and spell check issues, use after free in Mojo, use after free in web audio, out of bounds memory access, another use after free bug, and integer overflow in Skya, which for the last one, Google was aware of exploits, unfortunately in the wild, and as of last month, brought Chrome to 6.0 days for 2023. I'm going to amend that in just a moment. So up to 6 as of end of November, again, keeping things a little interesting. The high severity vulnerability is tracked to CVE 2023-6345 and was reported by Google's threat analysis group in late November. It also affected every other Chromium-based browser, which we'll get into in a few moments. But moving on, the next release after that, at the beginning of this month, on December 5th, brought Chrome to version 120 for Windows, macOS, and Linux. There were a total of 10 security fixes. 5 were disclosed by external researchers, for a total in 15,000 USD in bounties. There were 2 high-severity use after free issues, single medium vulnerability, and 2 low inappropriate implementation issues. On December 6th, another release dropped, but there was, well, nothing disclosed. Wah wah. Just kidding. That's a good thing, obviously. As much as it's great for me to have content on these webcasts, if there was a perfect month and nothing was released as well, no vulnerabilities disclosed, that would be excellent. And it would probably be my best webcast ever, let's agree. December 12th, however, another release dropped where there were 9 total security fixes, 6 disclosed by external researchers, $50,000 USD in bounties, another hefty release. Out of the 6 disclosed issues, 5 are rated as high severity and related to type confusion in the V8 JavaScript engine, one of the most vulnerable pieces we see in Chrome. Month after month, we see that the JavaScript engine is compromised, with another 4 actually use after free issues. There's also a single medium use after free issue and cascading style sheets. I always like to bring this up, and I'm going to, again, amend my statement from earlier. Looking back in 2021, it was a very tough year for Google users, as the browser had 16 zero-day exploits. Last year in 2022, there were 9. And this month, I was going to say, as I have a few of my notes here, that there weren't any, but we'll get to that in just a moment. There were actually 6 0 days so far as of right now in 2023. It is looking better than previous years, but I'm hoping we've only got about a week and a half that there's nothing else released. And I was hoping that we'd end it on 5. That brings me to the spicy content that dropped on me just now. There was a release today for Chrome, bringing Chrome to version 120.0.6099 and sub revision 129. This is actually, and I'm winging this in a way because I'm looking at the website right now because it just dropped, and there's his name again. I'll get to his name a little bit later. The external researcher, Clement, apologize if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Clement Lacine, and Vlad Stolyarov of Google's threat analysis group reported a high severity issue tracked to CVE 2023-7024 to resolve a heap buffer overflow issue in WebRTC. Google is aware that an exploit for this vulnerability exists in the wild. So what I was going to say was there are only 5 for this year up until today, but actually a few moments ago, since we started the webcast, because I checked literally 5 minutes before and this advisory was not there, they just dropped another update due to this particular issue. So if you haven't been watching the webcast, make sure that all of your devices are updated for Chrome as soon as possible. But that's not where it stops. Of course, bear in mind that many other Chromium browsers still received updates as well, and they're going to be releasing them obviously very shortly if they don't have them just yet for today. This includes Opera, Brave, and as well Microsoft Edge. Moving on to Microsoft Edge. Should have amended my slide there. I was making a joke there on the last one, obviously, that December 20th, yes, I can tick the box, and yes, an update was dropped today. Okay, moving on. Jokes aside, there were 2 releases for Microsoft Edge on the 29th of November. They fixed some various bugs and issues, as well as resolved the, again, Chrome 0 day from last month. December 7th, there were 2 new feature updates for Edge. Just to mention these and quote the website directly. Renderer app container. For extra security benefits, the Windows native app container is enabled by default. As a note, If enterprise organizations identify a compatibility issue due to code injection from security software, they should follow up with the software publisher directly. Alternatively, they can use the render app container enabled policy to trade off the security benefits in Edge with the other software. The other feature update, again on the 7th, was updating Smart Actions block list policy. To quote again, this policy is updated with the new policy option mappings. Admins can now configure the policy to control smart actions like definitions on websites or control smart actions and PDFs on websites. There were as well 6 new policies. Don't think I'll go through them for time today, but just one to note, configuring auto discard sleeping tabs, and actually another one as well that I thought was interesting, configuring the auto profile switching site list. Lastly, as well, another policy, you can allow your organization's logo from Entra to be overlaid on the Edge app icon of a work profile. That's a really important one. Just kidding. If that's your preference, of course, that does clean things up a bit. We usually don't see a feature release without a few Edge-specific vulnerabilities as well, and the 7th release of Edge did have 3. CVE 2023-38174 was an information disclosure vulnerability with a lower CVSS score of 4.3. CVE 2023-35618 was an elevation of privilege vulnerability, but a far more concerning CVSS score of 9.6, and if exploited, could lead to browser sandbox escape. Microsoft still assessed it, however, as less likely to exploit. Lastly, for the release, CVE 2023-36880 was an information disclosure vulnerability again, with a lower CVSS of 4.8. On December 14th, there were minor fixes and enhancements with only one Edge-specific vulnerability to highlight. This would be CVE's 2023-36878. That's a security feature bypass vulnerability with a lower CVSS of 4.3 that requires user interaction, and Microsoft again believes that exploitation is less likely. Okay, that's correct. Mozilla Firefox only received 2 updates since last month's webcast. On the 30th of November, because our last webcast was on the 28th, Firefox went to 120.0.1 with minor bug fixes and no security fixes to highlight. One of the fixes was for a bug causing persistent startup slowdowns and an issue causing 100% CPU usage on sites such as Google Maps. I find this interesting because last month, in mapping a vacation, I did actually have a lot of issues in using Firefox when accessing Google Maps. Maybe I was one of those that ran into the issue. It's possible. On December 19th, yesterday, Firefox 1.2.1 was released for main release and extended release users with 18 security fixes, 5 high, 8 moderate, 5 low. Security fixes include heap buffer overflow affecting WebGL. Multiple NSS NIST curves were susceptible to a side channel attack known as Minerva, and could allow an attacker to recover the private key. Also, potential exposure of uninitialized data, as well as their monthly memory safety bug fixes. This release also added some prompts for Windows users to install the Microsoft AV1 video extension. Firefox now supports voice control commands on macOS. Some of you may have been wanting that. Links can now be forced underlined, and some visual improvements to the PDF viewer. Any updates to Firefox as well typically also include security fixes to Mozilla Thunderbird. The additional products that received updates include Bitwarden, Cisco products with another typical CISA advisory. There are actually a few. Dropbox, Genesis Cloud, Google Drive, OrphanView, iTunes, Jenkins, Malwarebytes, Putty, Ring Central, Skype, Slack, Snagit, TeamViewer, and Zoom. So do make sure that if you have any of those products that you update. But that's not it. Apple. Last month was an amazing month for Apple users because there were no zero-day exploits to prioritize. But unfortunately, since last month's webcast, since the 30th, there were 2 additional exploits discovered in the wild. The first is tracked as CVE 2023-42916, and it is an out-of-bounds read issue in WebKit that, if exploited, could disclose sensitive information. This was discovered by the exact same researcher that discovered the Chrome-based zero-day from last month and the one today, Clement, again, Lacine, from Google's threat analysis group. The second, also disclosed by Clement, is another WebKit flaw tracked as CVE 2023-42917, dealing with a memory corruption vulnerability that, if exploited, could lead to arbitrary code execution. Apple stated on their advisories across multiple products that, quote, they are aware of a report this issue may have been exploited against, and I added this in there, various product lines, clearly, not just one, but many. Overall, the flaws affect macOS Sonoma, iOS and iPadOS versions 16 as well as 17, Safari 17, watchOS 10, and tvOS 17. The initial round of updates dropped on November 30th when the 0 days were disclosed, followed by another drop of updates across other products on December 11th. Out of all products and fixes, macOS Sonoma took the cake with a total of 42 security fixes since November 30th. There was as well a release yesterday, also providing a security fix to macOS Sonoma. It was clearly another bad month for Apple, and I'm sorry, Apple users, if any of you had been exploited or compromised in some way. If not, make sure that, of course, you are patching. Fortunately, again, with vendors such as these, they are on top of their advisories. So I always have to give Apple, Mozilla, Microsoft, Adobe respect for the fact that they are being transparent about the issues. I know Apple doesn't really count as a third-party product, but I was like covering it on this webcast just to inform my Apple audience, and especially with the focus on zero-day exploits this month. Of course, for any other products that might be running on your Apple devices, be sure to check the App Store, and update accordingly. Okay, perfect. I hope this has been informative and useful to everybody. If you enjoy the form of this webcast or not, please contact us, let us know. I always like to mention that the Syxsense team identifies, classifies, and pre-checks various patches and vulnerabilities that affect common endpoints and servers. To get a full listing of all the various issues that may impact your environment, be sure to check our website under resources. You'll see a link to the vulnerability database. What I also love about the vulnerability library that we provide is not only discussing the level of impact, but like everybody else, but we also offer recommendations and resolutions to every issue on that list. If you have any further questions, concerns, or suggestions for improvement, we would love to hear it. Thanks for your time, happy patching, and happy holidays.